It all started 8 years ago when he was hauling a giant lottery check, but instead of the jackpot, he got 7 years in juvie. Back then, the judge barked,
"Help protect them from worthless scum like you."
To put it mildly, that wasn't exactly a motivation for John to walk the straight and narrow. Then came a mail robbery.
Hit the ground, motherfuckers.
There's an asshole day parade?
The same judge slapped him with another 4 years, adding that stupidity should be a life sentence. 6 months after getting out surprise he's back in for car theft, John was released with one goal, revenge on the old judge. But talk about a buzzkill, the old man kicked the bucket 3 days before John got out. John was so pissed he shot up a phone booth. But then plot twist. John sees in the paper that the judge's son, Nelson Biederman, a total trust fund brat and narcissistic prick, is opening a memorial for his dad. John realized the sins of the father shall be visited upon the son. He started with some petty sabotage, broke into Nelson's car, stole some loose change, emptied the gas out of his inhaler, Nelson's asthmatic, and the cherry on top spat in his coffee twice. While Nelson was busy screaming at his subordinates, John watched.
Oh my.
When the rich kid had an asthma attack, he sprinted into a pharmacy, knocking everything over. The owners pegged him for a junkie, and John added fuel to the fire by firing a shot from his own piece. The result? The pharmacist's wife blasted Nelson with a shotgun, and the security cameras caught the whole thing. The board of directors for the foundation, who were already sick of Nelson's crap, decided to cut him loose. At the trial, his lawyer Dwayne was spouting total gibberish, referencing Jurassic Park. Nelson, who thought the jurors were idiots, which wasn't far from the truth, got 3 to 5 years in Rossmore. But for John, just knowing the rich kid was getting squeezed wasn't enough. He wanted a front row seat. So he just walked up to some undercover cops and bought drugs from them, pretending not to notice their cheap sunglasses. In court, he cut a deal to be sent specifically to Rossmore, in the same cell as Nelson. On the prison bus, John played the Good Samaritan and offered the terrified rich kid a deal to stick together. The warden gave them a warm welcome, a rifle butt to the teeth for asking questions, and some advice to shove his complaints up his ass. Now they're cellmates in a 20-square-foot box. Nelson is sobbing on the floor, and John is teaching him the ropes, telling him he needs to show a ferocious snarl, though on Nelson, it looks more like he's constipated. By the way, it costs the US $54 a day to house one of these characters. John jokes that it would have been cheaper to just let people steal car stereos. In the cafeteria, John started breaking down the prison food chain, casually pointing out that Leonard was the alpha everyone feared. He warned Nelson to clear the table by 12:15 sharp. Nelson, however, got lost in a nostalgic rant about his college glory days and completely missed the cue. Right then and there, directly in front of him, Leonard casually stabbed another inmate. A guard named Shanahan rushed over, cracked Leonard with his baton, and demanded to know who did it. Remembering John's advice, Nelson instantly pointed at Leonard. Problem was, back in the cell, Leonard made it very clear. In prison, you don't snitch. Lesson learned the hard way. Another unforgettable part of prison life turned out to be the showers. A massive inmate named Barry took an immediate interest in Nelson and started openly flirting with him. Before things could escalate, John stepped in and loudly claimed Nelson as his own, pulling a shiv on another inmate and announcing, "This little white ass is off limits to everyone else." Nelson awkwardly thanked him, but the whole situation left him deeply disturbed by what prison survival actually required.
You've got to get me out of here, now!
As Nelson struggled to process all this, his lawyer dropped more bad news. Nelson had no access to his father's foundation money. He'd been suspended as chairman for the duration of his sentence. Meanwhile, John was busy behind the scenes, bribing one inmate to regularly punch Nelson in the face and another in the cafeteria to mix absolutely vile stuff into his meals. Barry didn't back off either. In the showers, he kept harassing Nelson, clearly smitten. He even joked that he'd buy Nelson at any price. Eventually, Barry arranged what he called a private evening. Guard Shanahan conveniently assigned John to trash duty and accidentally left Nelson's cell unlocked. Within seconds, inmates grabbed Nelson, threw a bag over his head, and dragged him to a room decorated with candles and makeshift garlands. Barry entered like it was a date, offering Nelson homemade wine he'd brewed in a toilet. Things quickly took a darker turn when Barry pressed a knife to Nelson's throat after Nelson lied about Barry's weight. Barry, who apparently had zero tolerance for dishonesty, declared Nelson his property. He explained that Nelson would have to take care of him, but promised to go slow, starting with a kiss and an awkward nose rub. Later, Nelson wrote to his prison pen pal who, unbeknownst to him, was a young boy. While he was writing, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood casually urinated on him. It was a message from Leonard, who had just gotten out of solitary. John later told Nelson that inmates were already placing bets on how Leonard would eventually kill him. Still painfully naive, Nelson tried to apologize to Leonard. Leonard responded by stabbing him in the leg with a fork.
Okay. I deserve that.
He explained that Nelson had offended him just as badly as Leonard's own father once had, and that he'd killed his father the same way he planned to kill Nelson. Barry, meanwhile, kept expressing his feelings. Desperate, John suggested the only safe move was solitary confinement. To make that happen, John stood behind Nelson and Sucker, punched a guard. It worked. Nelson was thrown into isolation. Unfortunately, solitary didn't bring peace. After days alone, Nelson started hallucinating. 2 days in, he broke and went to the prison's resident chemist to buy something to end his life. The chemist sold him boat cleaner and a syringe. Nelson wrote to his pen pal, venting his rage and saying he wanted to line his enemies up and cut off their manhoods. What he didn't know was that the kid read the letter out loud to his entire class. Soon after, Leonard burst into Nelson's cell, soaked him with gasoline, and complained that Nelson wasn't Jewish apparently, that would have made burning him alive more enjoyable. Shockingly, Nelson fought back and managed to injure Leonard. During the struggle, Leonard mistook the syringe of boat cleaner for drugs, injected himself, and dropped dead on the spot. Moments later, a prison staffer dragged Leonard's corpse into the hallway. John was stunned this was never part of the plan. From that day on, everything changed. With Leonard gone, the Aryan Brotherhood backed Nelson, and he quickly rose to a position of power. He could give orders, and people actually listened. Still, not everything was settled. Barry had genuinely fallen in love with Nelson over the months, and Nelson's lack of affection crushed him. In an emotional meltdown, Barry nearly strangled Nelson in the bathroom. Feeling guilty over breaking Barry's heart, Nelson forgave him anyway. When members of the Aryan Brotherhood stormed into the bathroom to back Nelson up, he shocked everyone by stopping them and telling them to leave Barry alone. Somehow, in the chaos, John ended up taking the fall and landed in solitary himself. When he finally got out, he realized just how badly things had spiraled out of his control. Nelson was now basically running the entire prison. Not only that Nelson had organized a full-on musical starring the inmates. Watching all this, John grew more and more bitter. Nelson, on the other hand, sincerely thanked him, saying John had prepared him perfectly for prison life. John's revenge plan hadn't just failed, it had completely imploded. The next day was Nelson's parole hearing. To get ready, he was helped by his newest friend, Barry. John showed up in their cell one last time with a parting gift. An already open can of soda. He wished Nelson luck and handed it over. Nelson hesitated, clearly suspicious. John acted insulted and took a sip himself to prove it was fine. Reassured, Nelson drank the rest and collapsed seconds later. John, who had only taken a small sip, immediately started gagging and threw up in the toilet. With help from an accomplice, he dragged Nelson's unconscious body away. At the parole hearing the following day, Nelson showed up completely unaware that the words "white power" had been written across his forehead. The board didn't even hesitate, parole denied. Back in his cell, Nelson snapped and attacked his cellmate during a fight. Under pressure, the guy admitted that all the resentment came from Nelson's father, the judge. Guard Shanahan, irritated that a fight broke out without his supervision, reminded everyone that he was the one who scheduled violence around here. He announced that the issue would be settled Friday in the yard with a death match. One man would die, and Shanahan would personally kill the winner. To keep things official, a supervisor was assigned to oversee the event. Inmates immediately started placing bets on how ugly it would get, skulls cracked, ears bitten off, the usual. Before the fight, Nelson got a visit from Barry. Thanks entirely to Nelson, Barry had been labeled rehabilitated by the parole board. Still, Barry admitted he couldn't live without Nelson, calling him his fish. He offered to help Nelson escape. Nelson refused, saying, "I'm only leaving this place in a body bag." Through tears, Barry replied, "Then let's make it a body bag for two." Nelson came up with a plan. He contacted Dwayne and explained that if he remained in prison, control of his father's foundation would transfer to his son, who would run it until Nelson's release. To make that legal, Nelson adopted another inmate. Meanwhile, the warden caught wind of the death match and quietly placed a $50 bet on Nelson, the underdog. Friday came, and the yard was packed. The rules were simple. First one to die loses. Nelson armed himself with a screwdriver. His opponent showed up far better prepared. A shiv flew into the crowd. Another shattered against Nelson's makeshift body armor. Eventually, both men pulled out their real weapons, syringes filled with bright chemical-colored liquids. Nelson struck first with a lethal hit, but not before taking a fatal strike himself. Shanahan called it a tie and ordered the bodies removed before they start to stink. Nelson was buried, leaving his adopted son as the sole heir to an $8 million fortune. Barry, however, refused to leave the grave. That night, he dug it up with a shovel. What no one knew was that Nelson had earlier gotten a special compound from the prison chemist that put him into a coma. Barry had bribed the coroner to make sure everything went according to plan. As Nelson prepared to disappear, Barry reminded him they still had one more thing to do: rescue John. "If it weren't for that jerk," Barry said, "we never would have met." With that, they finally made peace. A year later, Barry and Nelson opened a winery called Duckling. The wine was not great. When a critic gave it a terrible review, John, now working at the winery along with several former inmates, paid him a visit. The critic quickly promised to revise the score to a perfect 100. The wine itself? Bitter, chemical, with a faint hint of ammonia. Everyone hated it, including the people who made it.